The cameras flash, the headlines scream, and the whispers echo across continents. But beneath the surface of royal grandeur lies a story that feels almost too staggering to believe. Imagine the scene. The gilded corridors of Buckingham Palace silent but tense. A king who has waited a lifetime to wear the crown now faced with the unthinkable. And a family once held up as the embodiment of unity, torn apart by doubts that strike at the very core of legacy and bloodline. The world has always been fascinated by royalty because it is not simply about castles and crowns. It is about lineage, legitimacy, and the fragile idea that tradition rests on truth. And in this story, King Charles himself takes center stage, not as a quiet monarch, but as a man determined to confront what he sees as the most dangerous deception of all. From the moment Harry and Meghan introduced Archie Harrison to the world, cameras clicking furiously as a beaming new father cradled his child in St. George's Hall, the public was asked to take the moment at face value. Here was the next generation of Windsor royalty. But over time, questions multiplied, subtle and whispered at first, then louder, seeping into newspaper columns and online forums. Was everything as it seemed? Why did so much about Archie's early days feel shielded from the public eye in ways that went beyond normal privacy? And when Lilibet Diana was later announced with equal fanfare, those murmurs only grew. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. For years, the royal household tried to keep its distance from the swirl of conspiracy and suspicion. After all, kings and queens do not lower themselves to battle gossip. But what happens when whispers evolve into something more threatening? When evidence begins to stack up and the integrity of the monarchy itself is on the line. That is the cliff's edge on which King Charles found himself standing. The proof he would eventually bring forward about Archie and Lilibet was not merely about two children. It was about the credibility of an institution that has survived wars, abdications, divorces, and scandal, yet now faced a challenge from within its own bloodline. The introduction to this storm is not one of sudden chaos, but of gradual build-up. Meghan Markle, ever the strategist, positioned herself and Harry as outsiders, victims of an ancient system too rigid to adapt. Her narrative resonated globally, particularly in America, where the couple recast themselves as modern freedom fighters against tradition's cold hand. Yet, behind palace walls, Charles watched this unfold with a measured eye. For him, it was not merely about public relations or popularity. He understood something deeper. The monarchy's survival rests not on Netflix deals or Oprah interviews, but on the public's unshakable belief that its bloodline is real, intact, and sacred. If that belief wavered, everything crumbled. In private, Charles began quietly asking questions, not with bluster, but with the resolve of a man who had seen his family shredded before by scandal. His own life bore the scars of betrayal and public humiliation. He knew what it meant for the crown to teeter under pressure, and he was determined that his reign would not collapse in similar fashion. Yet, the closer he looked, the more the inconsistencies piled up. It was not the headlines that troubled him most, but the small details, the ones the public rarely noticed. Records that did not align. Official documents that seemed delayed or incomplete. The troubling absence of verifiable details that, in royal tradition, are usually handled with ceremonial clarity. The middle of this introduction is where tension becomes undeniable. Think of Charles, pacing in the quiet of Clarence House, advisors murmuring in hushed tones, files sliding across polished wooden desks. Was he prepared to confront his own son? Was he willing to risk exposing a daughter-in-law who had already waged a relentless public relations battle against the monarchy? The answer came not from vanity or vengeance, but from duty. A king is not merely a father or a husband. He is the guardian of 1,000 years of lineage, sworn to protect it from doubt and deception. And when the evidence reached a point that could no longer be ignored, Charles made the decision. The truth must be revealed, no matter the cost. This moment was not simply about confronting Meghan Markle. It was about shutting down a narrative that threatened to rewrite the history and legitimacy of the monarchy. But as with any decision of this magnitude, the fallout would be seismic. Harry's loyalty would be tested in ways unimaginable. Meghan's carefully constructed image of control would begin to unravel. The public, long caught between admiration and skepticism, would finally see a curtain pulled back. And yet, as the introduction draws to a close, the weight of the moment rests not in the revelation itself, but in the anticipation of it. The stage is set, the pieces are moving, and the tension is palpable. A father prepared to confront his son, a king prepared to protect his crown, a wife prepared to fight for survival, and children whose very identities now hang in the balance. The question that lingers is not simply what Charles will reveal, but why he chose this moment in history to bring the truth to light. This is not a story of gossip or passing scandal. This is a battle for the heart of a monarchy. And as we step into the full unfolding of this drama, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. When the king himself decides to speak, the world must listen. The silence of the palace was almost deafening, the kind of silence that carries weight, as if the walls themselves know secrets too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Outside, the world carried on, unaware of the turmoil brewing within the royal family. Inside, however, King Charles sat at the center of a storm, a man finally crowned after decades of waiting, now facing the most personal crisis of his reign. It was not a foreign policy issue or a political scandal, but something far more intimate, far more corrosive, questions surrounding the legitimacy of his own grandchildren. This was not the kind of rumor a monarch could brush aside. This was a direct challenge to the royal bloodline, a line that had weathered centuries of upheaval, yet always managed to stand firm on the foundation of heritage and truth. The beginning of the introduction asks us to imagine Charles not as a distant figure in ceremonial robes, but as a father and grandfather wrestling with betrayal. He had endured public ridicule before, through the disintegration of his marriage to Diana, through the years of being painted as the villain in her tragic story, and through his long, difficult wait for acceptance alongside Camilla. Yet none of that compared to this moment, because those were personal scandals that affected his reputation. This, however, cut deeper. This was about the survival of the institution itself, an institution he had sworn to uphold and pass down to his son, and one day to his grandson. If Archie and Lilibet were not who they were claimed to be, the very notion of succession stood on shaky ground. In the middle of this introduction, tension thickens. Charles was no stranger to doubt. He had watched his mother, Queen Elizabeth, command respect with dignity and restraint, always staying above the fray. She understood that the monarchy survived because it rarely engaged directly with rumor. But times had changed. The internet age amplified whispers into global debates. Social media turned speculation into accepted narrative, and Meghan had mastered this modern battleground. By stepping into the limelight with carefully crafted interviews and projects, she reshaped the Sussex story into one of struggle and oppression, painting the palace as cold and unyielding. And for a time, it worked. Sympathy poured in, their story resonated, and their brand grew. Yet while Meghan's narrative drew attention, it also invited scrutiny. The inconsistencies surrounding Archie's birth certificate, the unusual secrecy around Lilibet's christening, the lack of transparent ceremonial moments that had always accompanied royal births, all of it became fodder for speculation. The palace had initially hoped these questions would fade with time, but instead they grew louder, forcing Charles to take notice. Was it possible that what began as whispers of doubt had transformed into a full-blown challenge to the monarchy's legitimacy? Could he afford to do nothing while the world speculated about whether his grandchildren were truly part of the Windsor line? The king found himself walking a tightrope. On one side was the love for his son, Harry, a boy he had once carried on his shoulders, a man he still longed to embrace despite years of estrangement. On the other side was his duty as sovereign, to guard the integrity of the monarchy at all costs. For Charles, this was not a choice between family and crown. It was a collision of the two. He knew that revealing the truth would fracture his relationship with Harry forever, perhaps destroy any chance of reconciliation. Yet he also knew that concealing it, or worse, ignoring it, would allow the monarchy to wither under suspicion. The thought gnawed at him. How would history judge him? As the king who chose silence, or the one who dared to confront the truth, no matter how painful? These were the questions that weighed on him in sleepless nights, his mind replaying the same images. Meghan smiling for cameras, Harry defending her fiercely, Archie and Lilibet presented to the world with layers of mystery instead of clarity. The stakes could not be higher. The legitimacy of the crown is not a trinket one can gamble with. It is the lifeblood of the monarchy itself. And so Charles began to act. Quietly at first, commissioning private investigations, requesting documents, scrutinizing details that most people would overlook. He did not do this with malice, but with precision, like a man determined to find clarity in the fog. Advisors hesitated, worried about the implications, but Charles pressed on. If there was proof to be found, he wanted it. If there was deception, he needed to know. And as files were opened, records cross-checked, and testimonies quietly gathered, the king began to see a picture that chilled him to his core. The end of this introduction does not deliver the revelation itself, but the gravity of what it means to carry such knowledge. Imagine Charles holding a folder of documents late at night, his hands trembling slightly as he realizes that what lies within could shatter his family and redefine the monarchy. He knows he cannot reveal it lightly. He knows timing will be everything. But he also knows there is no turning back. Once the proof is made public, Meghan's carefully woven narrative will unravel. Harry will be left torn between love and loyalty, and the world will never look at the House of Windsor the same way again. And so we leave the introduction with questions hanging heavy in the air. Why now? What gave Charles the courage to step into the fray when silence might have been easier? What kind of proof does he hold that would justify such a seismic move? And perhaps most hauntingly, what does this mean for Archie and Lilibet, two children caught in the crossfire of history, innocence lost to the ruthless weight of royal duty? The calm before the storm in any great drama often looks deceptively ordinary, and that was exactly how the months preceding King Charles's decisive move felt to the outside world. To most observers, the royal family appeared to be in a delicate but manageable state of equilibrium. Harry and Meghan had settled into their California life, still generating headlines, but seemingly far removed from the day-to-day affairs of the monarchy. Charles was focusing on his role as king, balancing state duties with the challenge of modernizing a centuries-old institution. William and Kate carried on steadily as the dependable faces of the next generation. On the surface, it seemed the crisis had cooled, the noise from the Oprah interview had quieted, and the monarchy had returned to a kind of uneasy normal. But beneath that stillness was a simmering unease, the sense that something fundamental was not quite right. Royal insiders could feel it. There was an unspoken tension whenever Harry's name was raised during meetings, a sense of unresolved business that no amount of polite smiles or carefully worded press releases could erase. The calm, in truth, was nothing more than a fragile pause, a moment of silence before the crash of thunder. The public may not have noticed the shift, but those closest to the king did. They watched him grow more pensive, more withdrawn, not in the way of a man overwhelmed, but in the way of a man calculating. It was as if Charles knew the peace could not hold forever and was preparing himself for what was to come. The story of this calm period begins with Harry and Meghan's growing detachment from Britain. Their lives in Montecito were painted as idyllic, sun-drenched mornings, high-profile neighbors, glamorous events. Meghan cultivated her public image with relentless precision, carefully choosing interviews and appearances that reinforced her message of empowerment and victimhood in equal measure. Harry, meanwhile, seemed increasingly caught between roles. At times the supportive husband, at times the lost prince longing for the security of his past. Together, they presented themselves as independent figures breaking free of royal constraints. Yet in truth, they remained tethered to the very monarchy they had renounced. Every deal they struck, every documentary they filmed, every book they published, each one was built upon their royal connection. Charles observed this from a distance, but not without concern. He understood better than anyone that the crown could withstand scandal, but it could not withstand corrosion. A monarchy's authority rests not only on laws and traditions, but on public faith, and he sensed that Harry and Meghan's relentless self-promotion was eroding that faith. People began asking questions not just about the couple's conduct, but about the very legitimacy of what they represented. The calm before the storm was filled with whispers that refused to die. Why were there inconsistencies in Archie's early documents? Why had the family photo releases been so tightly controlled? Why was Lilibet christened quietly in California rather than in the Church of England with the transparency of tradition. For Charles, each question was like a hairline crack in the foundation of the monarchy. One or two might be dismissed, but together they formed a pattern too troubling to ignore. Still, he did not act rashly. The calm before the storm was marked by restraint. He listened, he gathered information, and he weighed his options. He knew that one wrong move could turn the situation into a disaster. If he moved too soon, he would appear vindictive. If he waited too long, the monarchy itself could appear complicit in deception. Timing would be everything, and Charles was determined to choose his moment wisely. This period of quiet calculation was also shaped by the actions of William and Kate. As the Prince and Princess of Wales, they understood their role was not to fan the flames but to reinforce stability. They doubled down on public duties, presenting themselves as the reliable face of the monarchy's future. To many, they were a reminder of what the crown could be when unencumbered by drama. Yet even in their steadiness, they could not escape the shadow of Harry and Meghan. Every time William spoke publicly, comparisons were drawn. Every appearance by Kate was dissected against Meghan's latest headline. It was as though the monarchy itself had become split into two narratives, one of continuity and one of disruption. The calm was deceptive in another sense too. To the world, it looked as though Harry and Meghan had won a kind of quiet victory. They had built a life away from the palace, secured lucrative deals, and fashioned themselves into global celebrities. But behind the scenes, their foundations were shakier than they appeared. Netflix projects were under scrutiny, Spotify had ended their deal, and whispers suggested their financial independence was more fragile than advertised. Meghan continued to project confidence, but those around her could sense the growing desperation to maintain relevance. This undercurrent of instability would later make Charles's decision all the more devastating, because it would strike at a moment when their fortress of influence was already beginning to crack. During this calm before the storm, Harry's position became increasingly tragic. Torn between his love for Meghan and his complicated bond with his family, he often appeared haunted. Friends close to him described a man who felt exiled yet still longed for home, who spoke of loyalty to his wife but privately missed the security of the family he had left behind. In this fragile period, Harry was a man walking on thin ice, and Charles, ever the watchful father, saw it clearly. He knew that when the truth finally came out, it would not only break Meghan's carefully constructed narrative, but also shatter Harry's illusions. The king dreaded this, but he also knew it was inevitable. The calm period was also a time of subtle maneuvers within the palace itself. Advisors began quietly preparing contingency plans, drafting statements, and discussing possible fallout scenarios. Nothing was confirmed, but everyone sensed something looming. They could not name it, but they felt it. The palace had lived through abdications and scandals before, but never one that cut so deeply into the question of lineage. Some courtiers urged silence, others pushed for action, but Charles listened to them all, absorbing their counsel while keeping his final decision close to his chest. And so the calm stretched on, but it was not a peaceful calm. It was the kind of stillness that comes when a storm gathers just beyond the horizon, the air heavy, the silence unnatural. Everyone knew something was coming, even if they did not know what. And in the heart of Buckingham Palace, King Charles prepared himself for the moment when silence would no longer suffice. The calm before the storm was not a reprieve, but a countdown, and once the storm broke, nothing in the monarchy would ever be the same again. Meghan's master plan did not emerge overnight. It was the result of years of calculation, a slow and deliberate construction of image, influence, and strategy. To understand how it unfolded, one has to look back to the earliest days of her relationship with Harry, when her ambitions were still carefully cloaked in charm and relatability. At first, she was the outsider who captured the world's attention, the actress who had seemingly stepped into a fairy tale. Yet behind the glamorous headlines and glowing magazine covers, Meghan was already crafting a long-term narrative, one that would position her not just as a duchess, but as a global figure independent of the monarchy. In the beginning, Meghan played her role with precision. She knew the public adored the idea of a modern, mixed-race woman entering the royal family, and she leaned into that symbolism. She gave polished interviews, presented herself as a fresh voice, and carefully navigated the expectations of royal life. at least in the earliest days. But it did not take long for her to realize that her power was not in conforming to the institution, but in contrasting with it. The royal family had always thrived on restraint, silence, and mystery. Meghan's instincts told her that her influence would grow stronger if she broke those unspoken rules. By speaking, by sharing, by projecting her own story, she could create a version of events where she was not simply Harry's wife, but a heroine standing against an antiquated system. The master plan crystallized once she and Harry began to distance themselves from palace protocols. Every moment of friction, whether about press coverage, palace staff, or royal traditions, was transformed into material for the larger narrative Meghan was building. She began framing her life not as one of privilege, but as one of persecution. She wasn't merely leaving Britain. She was escaping a toxic environment. She wasn't rejecting royal duties. She was breaking free from oppression. Each move was carefully positioned to generate sympathy, and each time, the global media amplified her voice. The real brilliance of her plan lay in how she fused personal grievance with global relevance. Meghan understood that modern audiences connect with stories of struggle and triumph. By presenting herself as a victim of racism, sexism, and institutional cruelty, she tapped into broader social conversations. She was no longer just a duchess. She was a symbol, a woman of color standing against centuries of entrenched power. And this shift gave her influence that extended far beyond the palace walls. In America, particularly, she and Harry were celebrated as disruptors, voices of modernity against a stale monarchy. But behind this growing influence, there was an unmistakable pattern. Meghan's appearances were not random, they were carefully timed. Major interviews coincided with royal milestones, ensuring maximum attention. Statements about her struggles emerged when public sympathy for the monarchy was otherwise high, redirecting the conversation back to her. Even personal revelations, like her miscarriage or struggles with mental health, were positioned within the broader arc of her victimhood narrative. Each disclosure strengthened her bond with audiences while subtly casting the palace as the silent oppressor. Part of her master plan involved weaving Harry deeper into her narrative. He became not just her husband, but her co-star, a man who had broken free of his gilded cage to support his wife. Harry's loyalty to Meghan became central to the story, presented as proof of her worthiness and the righteousness of their joint struggle. Yet, in reality, it also isolated him from his family, making reconciliation harder with each public statement. This isolation served Meghan's purpose well, for it ensured Harry remained firmly aligned with her, unable to easily return to the fold of his family without unraveling the image they had constructed together. Their deals with Netflix, Spotify, and publishers were not just financial opportunities. They were vehicles to cement the narrative further. The documentaries and podcasts were framed as honest reflections, but in truth, they functioned as carefully edited propaganda pieces. Meghan positioned herself as the voice of reason, the misunderstood duchess with wisdom to offer the world. Harry was the wounded prince, finally finding his voice thanks to her courage. Each project reinforced the myth that they were martyrs to a cruel system, and each one widened the chasm between them and the monarchy. Meghan also cultivated powerful allies, particularly in the United States. By aligning herself with celebrities, activists, and influential figures, she expanded her reach far beyond royal circles. These relationships gave her credibility in progressive spaces and ensured that her narrative was echoed by prominent voices. Every article, every red carpet appearance, every public friendship was part of a deliberate effort to secure her position in a world where influence matters more than tradition. But a master plan, no matter how well constructed, always carries cracks. The same boldness that fueled Meghan's rise also drew scrutiny. The inconsistencies in her accounts, the embellishments in her stories, the details that didn't quite align, all of these began to be noticed. And while she had mastered the art of turning criticism into proof of persecution, she could not silence every doubt. Slowly, questions about Archie and Lilibet became entangled with broader doubts about Meghan's honesty. If she had exaggerated in one area, what else might she be concealing? For Charles, watching this unfold was both fascinating and alarming. He recognized the brilliance of Meghan's plan, but he also saw its danger. Every move she made eroded public trust in the monarchy, shifting sympathy to her while painting the palace as rigid and cold. Yet he also noticed the one vulnerability Meghan could not escape. Her narrative was built on the foundation of her children. Archie and Lilibet were central to the image she projected. The young heirs cruelly cut off from their heritage, symbols of innocence denied by the institution. If there was even a shadow of doubt about their legitimacy, the entire narrative risked collapse. And so, while Meghan executed her master plan with confidence, Charles began quietly shaping his own counterplan. He understood that the monarchy could withstand Meghan's public attacks, but it could not withstand falsehoods about lineage. If proof existed that challenged her narrative, he would have no choice but to use it. Meghan's plan had relied on the assumption that the palace would remain silent, that tradition would prevent the monarchy from engaging directly. But she had underestimated one thing: Charles's willingness to act when the very foundation of the crown was at stake. The calm before the storm gave Meghan the illusion of control. Her plan seemed to be working, her influence expanding, her narrative accepted by millions. Yet what she could not see was the quiet resolve building within the king, the determination to bring forward proof that would unravel everything she had built. Her master plan had succeeded in winning public sympathy, but it had also provoked the one man who could bring it all crashing down. The growing doubts did not come like a lightning strike. They arrived slowly, quietly, a murmur here, a hesitation there, until they spread like ripples across a still pond. At first, they seemed harmless, the idle chatter of tabloids that had long fed on royal intrigue. But with each passing month, those doubts gained weight, seeping into conversations among journalists, royal watchers, and eventually the public at large. The monarchy had always been the target of rumors, but this was different. This was not about fashion choices or strained smiles at public events. This was about children, about lineage, about whether the future of the monarchy itself rested on foundations weaker than anyone dared admit. Archie's introduction to the world was the beginning. The carefully staged photo call inside Windsor Castle should have been an event of celebration, another chapter in the long continuity of royal births. But instead of reassuring the public, it raised eyebrows. The photographs felt oddly detached. Meghan's presentation of her newborn appeared rehearsed, Harry's body language strained. Where past royal babies had been paraded before the cameras with openness, Archie was shielded in a way that felt deliberate, as if something was being hidden. At the time, most dismissed it as a modern couple's desire for privacy, a perfectly reasonable wish. Yet for others, it was the first crack in the facade. Why did it feel so different? Why did this introduction leave more questions than answers? Then came the documents. Every royal birth is accompanied by official records, but Archie's birth certificate seemed to carry inconsistencies. Meghan's name was reportedly altered at one point, sparking confusion about why such changes were made at all. While the palace brushed it off as administrative adjustments, the explanations never fully satisfied. For those predisposed to suspicion, the change became evidence of a larger cover-up. For Charles, it became one more note in a growing ledger of irregularities. When Lilibet Diana was born, the pattern repeated. Instead of the traditional royal christening in Britain, complete with formal photographs and carefully documented ceremonial moments, Meghan and Harry opted for a private event in California. The choice was framed as practical, even necessary, given their distance from royal life. But for a family that thrives on ritual and documentation, the absence of a transparent record was glaring. Where were the photographs? Where were the witnesses beyond a small, hand-picked group? And more importantly, why were even senior royals unsure about the details? The doubts began to spread among journalists. Seasoned royal correspondents, who had spent decades covering the family, started to whisper about how unusual the secrecy was. They knew privacy was always valued, but never to this extent. There had always been a balance between personal boundaries and public duty, and Archie and Lilibet's situations tipped the scale too far toward concealment. Was it only about protecting the children, or was there something more to hide? Charles was not immune to these whispers. Though he had tried to remain above the speculation, advisors eventually brought him reports from trusted insiders. The king did not act on gossip, but he listened carefully, weighing each detail. What disturbed him most was not the rumors themselves. but the consistency with which they returned. Every few months, a new inconsistency surfaced, another small detail that did not quite fit the pattern of royal tradition. Alone, each might have been dismissed. Together, they painted a picture that could not be ignored. Public reaction mirrored this unease. Social media became a breeding ground for speculation, with hashtags and theories circulating widely. Some accused the monarchy of complicity, of covering up truths for the sake of appearances. Others accused Meghan of manipulation, of creating a narrative that defied scrutiny. The polarization was stark. To her supporters, Meghan was a victim of cruel conspiracy theories. To her detractors, she was a skilled deceiver, hiding something monumental. Caught in the middle was the monarchy itself, its reputation bruised no matter which side people believed. The growing doubts also began to influence the royal family's internal dynamics. William, ever cautious, worried that the rumors were damaging the institution's credibility. Kate, mindful of the children, feared the long-term impact of speculation on George, Charlotte, and Louis, who would grow up in a world where their cousin's legitimacy was constantly questioned. For Harry, the doubts were like daggers. He had tried desperately to shield Meghan and the children, but each new headline reminded him that his family's integrity was on trial. For Charles, the doubts were no longer just a public relations issue. They had become a matter of duty. The king knew that once doubt takes root, it spreads quickly, eroding trust like rust on iron. The monarchy could survive scandal. It had done so many times before, but it could not survive a credibility crisis over bloodline. The very essence of monarchy is inheritance, the assurance that titles and thrones are passed down through legitimate heirs. Without that assurance, the institution loses its foundation. Charles understood that these doubts, if left unaddressed, threatened not just his reign but the future of William, and eventually George. The stakes could not be higher. The middle of this chapter sharpens the tension further. Charles began to quietly test the waters. He spoke in private with legal advisors, seeking clarification on what powers he held regarding succession if irregularities were confirmed. He asked archivists to review past royal records, searching for precedent. He even had discreet conversations with trusted clergy about the sanctity of christening records. None of these actions were public, but they reflected a growing conviction. He could not ignore the doubts any longer. Meanwhile, Meghan continued her public strategy, seemingly unaware of how much attention the inconsistencies were attracting. She positioned herself as the wrong duchess, the woman cast aside by an unfeeling monarchy. Every appearance she made was polished, every statement carefully framed. But the more she insisted on her narrative, the more it invited scrutiny. Skeptics noticed the gaps, the omissions, the unanswered questions. Each polished performance only fueled the sense that something remained concealed. By the time this chapter closes, the calm has been shattered. The doubts are no longer whispers but storms, swelling louder with each revelation. The public is restless, the media relentless, and within the palace, Charles is no longer content to sit silently. He knows the time is coming when he must act. For years, the monarchy has relied on discretion as its shield, but now, discretion has turned into complicity. The growing doubts have reached a tipping point, and the king realizes he must be the one to provide answers. King Charles stepping in was not a single dramatic moment, but a process that built over time, the culmination of months of doubt, careful observation, and an internal battle between his identity as a father and his duty as king. For most of his life, Charles had been cast in roles chosen for him by others. The heir, the dutiful son, the husband to Diana, the man who waited longer than any monarch in British history to take the crown. Now, he was finally king, a role he had prepared for all his life, and with that crown came an authority he had never wielded before. And yet, what drove him to act was not the politics of the realm or the ceremonial duties of his office, but something far more personal, the gnawing fear that the very core of the monarchy, its sacker. It began quietly, in private meetings held behind the thick curtains of Clarence House and Buckingham Palace. Charles had long been cautious about involving himself directly in controversy, knowing how easily a king's words could spark headlines. But the whispers around Archie and Lilibet were becoming impossible to ignore, and for a monarch who had sworn to preserve the integrity of the crown, silence was no longer an option. He began summoning advisors, not in large groups, but individually, testing their reactions, probing for information. Some counseled patience, urging him not to validate rumors by addressing them. Others, however, admitted what Charles already knew, that the doubts were spreading, and inaction would only embolden them further. The king's instincts told him that this was not just about perception. He had seen the inconsistencies in documents, had heard from insiders who noticed the secrecy surrounding the births and christenings. What unsettled him most was the feeling that the palace itself had been kept deliberately at arm's length by Harry and Meghan, excluded from traditions that had always been public. For Charles, this was not merely defiance, it was concealment. And concealment always begged the same question: what was there to hide? Stepping in meant risk. Charles knew that by pursuing answers, he would be walking into dangerous territory. He risked alienating his youngest son completely. He risked further public backlash from Meghan's supporters, who would see any inquiry as vindictive. But he also knew that failing to act could be catastrophic. A monarchy without trust in its lineage is a monarchy already crumbling. Every king faces a moment where his choices define his reign. For Charles, this was it. The middle of this chapter focuses on the mechanics of his decision. Charles began assembling a small, trusted circle. These were men and women who had proven their loyalty over decades, people who understood the gravity of the crown's survival. Together, they began a quiet review of records, starting with Archie's birth certificate, then moving on to documentation surrounding Lilibet's birth. Charles did not want rumors. He wanted facts, indisputable and verifiable. And as the details emerged, his suspicions only deepened. Documents were altered. Records were delayed. Traditional procedures had been bypassed. Each discovery was small, but together they painted a picture that was deeply troubling. In parallel, Charles began reaching out to figures outside the palace. He spoke with legal advisors about the implications of succession should proof of irregularities come to light. He consulted clergy about the legitimacy of christenings performed in private, away from the Church of England. He even quietly sought the opinions of constitutional experts, framing his questions hypothetically, but with enough weight to make clear that something serious was at stake. These consultations did not provide easy answers, but they underscored the complexity of what he was dealing with. If proof emerged that challenged Archie and Lilibet's place in the royal line, the fallout would not just be personal, it would be constitutional. For Charles, stepping in also meant facing his own family. In private conversations with William, he hinted at his concerns, though he stopped short of full disclosure. William, pragmatic and fiercely protective of the monarchy, urged caution but made it clear he shared his father's unease. Kate, too, expressed concern, particularly for the impact on her own children, who would inevitably inherit a monarchy shaped by whatever decisions were made now. Harry, however, remained in the dark. Charles could not yet bring himself to confront his son, knowing that once he did, there would be no return. What gave Charles the resolve to press forward was not anger or resentment, but clarity of duty. He had lived long enough to see how secrecy and scandal could erode the monarchy. He had seen how his own mistakes had become global spectacles, weakening the crown's moral authority. He had endured decades of waiting, often mocked as the eternal heir, and now that he was finally king, he would not allow his reign to be defined by deception. To step in was not a choice, but an obligation. The end of this chapter builds toward inevitability. Charles knew that once he took the first step, the rest would follow. The palace would have to prepare for confrontation. Meghan would launch counterattacks. Harry would be torn apart by the truth. But Charles no longer feared the storm. He had come to see it as necessary. Better to face it head-on than allow it to grow unchecked. And so, with quiet resolve, King Charles stepped in. No announcements, no public proclamations, just a determined monarch setting in motion a process that would lead to revelations the world was unprepared for. The father in him dreaded what was to come. The king in him knew it could not be avoided. The discovery of the secret files marked the moment when quiet suspicion hardened into undeniable certainty. For months, King Charles had endured whispers, small inconsistencies, and gnawing doubts. But whispers are not enough for a king. He needed proof, something solid and irrefutable, something that could withstand the glare of public scrutiny and the test of history. That proof came in the form of documents locked away, records that had been deliberately buried, their existence known only to a handful of officials. To most of the world, these were invisible. To Charles, they were the key to unraveling the greatest deception the monarchy had faced in generations. The files did not fall into his lap. They were uncovered through persistence, through the meticulous efforts of a small group of trusted aides tasked with combing through archives. The search began with routine records, birth certificates, hospital logs, baptismal documents. But what emerged was a pattern of redactions, missing details, and inconsistencies that could no longer be explained as clerical oversight. Hospitals that should have had standard documentation for Archie's birth reported incomplete entries. Officials responsible for registering Lilibet's birth certificate hesitated, citing unusual delays. Even the simplest details, like attending physicians or witnesses, were either missing or contradicted by other sources. What disturbed Charles most was not the presence of irregularities, but the deliberate nature of them. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to obscure the truth, layering falsehood over fact until the real story was buried under paperwork. In a monarchy built on transparency of lineage, this level of concealment was damning. And then came the discovery that changed everything. A sealed folder, marked confidential, held in a restricted section of records. It contained reports prepared during the period when Harry and Meghan were transitioning out of royal life. These reports detailed internal concerns raised at the time, noting inconsistencies in the handling of Archie's and Lilibet's official documentation. The reports had never been made public. They had been quietly filed away, too sensitive to expose, too dangerous to ignore. For Charles, reading those files was like lifting a veil. The language was clinical, the tone cautious, but the implications were devastating. The files suggested that key details about Archie and Lilibet's births did not align with the standards expected of royal heirs. Some entries pointed to discrepancies in the timeline of Meghan's pregnancy. Others raised questions about who had been present at the births. A note scribbled by one official captured the essence of the problem. Verification incomplete. Subject to dispute. That phrase haunted Charles. Verification incomplete. How could the monarchy survive if its heirs were shadowed by such uncertainty? The middle of this chapter focuses on the emotional toll the files took on the king. Imagine Charles late at night, seated at a heavy oak desk, his glasses perched low as he reads line after line of carefully worded reports. Around him, the palace is silent, but inside him, a storm rages. He thinks of his grandchildren, innocent of the controversies surrounding them. He thinks of Harry, his son, so fiercely protective of Meghan, so willing to defy his family in her defense. And he thinks of Meghan herself, the woman who had presented herself as victim and heroine, but who now appeared to be at the center of a deception that threatened the monarchy's survival. The files did not answer every question, but they painted a picture too damning to ignore. What the king understood in that moment was that he no longer had the luxury of silence. The files represented more than hidden truths. They were weapons, left buried. They would continue to corrode the monarchy from within, feeding rumor and speculation until the institution collapsed under its own secrecy. Revealed, they would ignite a firestorm, but at least the monarchy would confront it openly. For Charles, the choice was no longer between peace and conflict. The choice was between deception and truth. The king's circle reacted with caution when he shared his findings. Some urged him to keep the files sealed, arguing that revealing them would do more damage than good. Others argued that the monarchy's legitimacy depended on full transparency. Charles listened to them all, but deep down he knew his path was already set. He had seen too much, read too much. He could not stand before his people, before his grandchildren, and pretend he did not know. The end of this chapter builds on the weight of inevitability. The files sat before him, evidence that could no longer be ignored. Each page was a reminder that the monarchy was not invulnerable, that even centuries of tradition could be undone by secrecy. As Charles closed the folder for the final time, he knew that the storm was no longer approaching. It was here. His decision would change everything. His relationship with Harry, the public's perception of Meghan, and the future of the crown itself. But as king, he also knew that the monarchy could not survive on half-truths. It had survived wars, abdications, divorces, and scandals. It could not survive doubt about who truly carried royal blood. A family divided is always the most painful chapter in any royal saga, because it reveals that beneath the crowns, jewels, and centuries of tradition, these are still people bound by blood and emotion. Yet in the House of Windsor, when divisions erupt, they are never private. They spill across front pages, ignite global debates, and become wounds that shape history. When King Charles finally confronted the reality of the files in his possession, he understood that the first cracks would not appear in Parliament or in public opinion, but inside his own family. That was where the storm would hit hardest. The earliest signs of division were subtle. William and Kate, already burdened with the responsibility of being the monarchy's future, instinctively sided with caution. For William, the matter was not just about exposing deception. It was about protecting the institution he had been raised to inherit. He had long distrusted Meghan, viewing her as someone more concerned with control than duty, and the files only confirmed his fears. Kate, who had tried to maintain civility with Meghan during their brief years as working royals, also felt the weight of betrayal. She worried about the emotional damage it would cause George, Charlotte, and Louis to grow up in a world where their cousins were surrounded by questions of legitimacy. To William and Kate, Charles's decision to act was painful but necessary. Harry, on the other hand, was trapped in a torment unlike anything he had ever experienced. His relationship with Meghan was built on fierce loyalty, on the belief that together they could withstand any storm. For him, the doubts about Archie and Lilibet were not just attacks on Meghan. They were attacks on his entire identity as a husband and father. When whispers of Charles's inquiries reached him, Harry reacted with anger. To him, this was proof that the monarchy had always distrusted Meghan, always sought to undermine her. He refused to consider that there might be truth in the files, insisting that the entire ordeal was yet another example of the crown trying to silence them. For Charles, watching his sons pull in opposite directions was agony. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that the family could come together in the face of truth, but instead it seemed to deepen the fault lines. William became more resolute, urging his father to act decisively and expose the deception before it consumed them all. Harry became more defensive, retreating further into Meghan's orbit, convinced that his family was plotting against him. The two brothers, once inseparable, were now speaking only through clenched jaws and icy glares. Camilla's role in this division was complicated. As queen consort, she supported Charles unconditionally, reminding him of his duty and bolstering his resolve. Yet as a stepmother, she also recognized the cost of his decision. She had seen the way Harry looked at Meghan, with the same desperation Charles himself had once shown for love. She warned him that pursuing this truth would not just divide the family. It would destroy whatever fragile thread of reconciliation still existed. Charles listened, but in the end, he knew he could not allow sentiment to outweigh responsibility. The middle of this chapter focuses on the private confrontations that revealed just how fractured the family had become. Behind closed doors, tempers flared. William accused Harry of being blind, of allowing Meghan to manipulate him. Harry accused William of jealousy, of never accepting Meghan from the beginning. Charles tried to mediate, but his attempts at diplomacy only seemed to widen the rift. Each conversation ended the same way. Harry storming out, William simmering with frustration, and Charles left staring into silence, a king who could command nations but could not unite his own sons. Beyond the immediate family, the division spread to the wider royal circle. Princess Anne, pragmatic as ever, sided firmly with Charles, reminding him that duty must come before emotion. Prince Edward and Sophie, quieter but equally committed to the crown, also lent their support. The younger generation, however, found themselves confused. George, Charlotte, and Louis were shielded from the details but could sense the tension. Archie and Lilibet, too young to understand, became pawns in a conflict they had no control over. Even extended relatives whispered among themselves, each forced to choose between loyalty to Harry or to the monarchy. The public, too, began to sense the division. While nothing had yet been announced, the strain between the brothers was visible in every rare public appearance. Body language spoke louder than words. William stiff and restrained, Harry defensive and withdrawn. Commentators dissected every glance, every gesture, feeding speculation that something monumental was brewing behind palace walls. The family's division was no longer just a private matter. It was a visible fracture in the face of a monarchy that had always prided itself on unity. For Charles, the pain of a divided family was sharpened by memories of his own past. He thought of his parents, of the way his mother had held the family together through crises, of the sacrifices she had made for duty. He wondered if he was failing where she had succeeded, if his decision to pursue the truth was tearing apart the very thing he had sworn to protect. Yet deep down, he knew the truth. The family had been divided long before the files. Meghan's arrival had accelerated it, but the roots of the rift went deeper, into resentment, rivalry, and wounds that had never healed. The files had not created the division. They had only exposed it. The end of this chapter lingers on the image of a king caught between two worlds. On one side, a son who saw himself as a protector of truth, urging his father to act for the sake of the crown. On the other, a son who felt betrayed, convinced his father was complicit in a campaign against his wife. Charles stood at the center, torn between love and duty, but knowing that soon, he would have to choose. The family was divided, perhaps beyond repair, and once the truth came out, the division would no longer be private. It would be permanent, carved into history, a scar that the House of Windsor would carry forever. The media storm broke like a tidal wave, relentless and impossible to contain. The monarchy had always lived under the watchful eye of journalists, photographers, and commentators, but this was different. This was not a scandal whispered in backrooms or speculated on in tabloids. This was a story that carried the weight of legitimacy, a narrative that touched the very heart of succession, and the press pounced on it with a ferocity unmatched in recent memory. It began with leaks. A single report in a respected British broadsheet hinted at internal disputes over documentation relating to the Sussex children. The phrasing was careful, cautious, but it was enough to ignite a frenzy. Other outlets followed quickly, each racing to confirm details, each determined not to be left behind. Soon, headlines blared across newspapers and online platforms. Questions about Archie and Lilibet's births, whispers of irregular records, speculation about King Charles's private concerns. What had once been whispered in corners was now shouted on front pages. The palace's strategy of silence, which had carried them through past controversies, faltered under the weight of this storm. Every hour brought new speculation. Television anchors dissected timelines, analysts debated the constitutional implications, and social media became a battlefield of clashing narratives. Supporters of Meghan rushed to her defense, insisting that the scrutiny was nothing more than racism and bias against a strong woman of color. Critics seized on the inconsistencies, framing Meghan as a manipulator who had deceived not just Harry, but the entire institution of the monarchy. The polarization was stark, and the storm fed on itself, growing louder with every passing day. For Charles, the media storm was both a validation and a nightmare. On one hand, it confirmed what he already knew. The doubts could no longer be ignored. On the other hand, it robbed him of control. He had hoped to manage the revelation carefully, to present the truth in a way that preserved dignity. But the leaks had changed everything. Now the narrative was being shaped not by the crown, but by the press, and in the court of public opinion, perception often mattered more than truth. The middle of this chapter explores how the media storm consumed every aspect of public life. Breakfast television programs featured heated debates between royal commentators and journalists, some defending Meghan, others calling for Charles to speak. In America, the story was covered with a distinctly sympathetic tone toward Meghan, casting her as a woman once again under siege by a hostile institution. In Britain, the coverage was more divided, with some outlets demanding accountability and others urging restraint. Internationally, the story became a spectacle, a soap opera played out in real time, gripping audiences from Australia to Canada. The frenzy extended beyond traditional media. Social platforms exploded with hashtags, conspiracy threads, and viral videos analyzing every scrap of information. Users scrutinized old interviews, photographs, and timelines, piecing together theories that ranged from the plausible to the absurd. Some posts claimed to have uncovered proof of surrogacy. Others alleged forged documents. while others insisted the entire saga was a smear campaign orchestrated by the palace. The noise was deafening, and amid the chaos, the truth became harder and harder to distinguish. Meghan, ever conscious of her image, tried to fight back against the storm. Carefully worded statements were released through friendly outlets, emphasizing her pain, her innocence, and her role as a devoted mother. Allies spoke on her behalf, denouncing the speculation as cruel and baseless. Yet even as her camp pushed back, the questions did not subside. In fact, every denial only fueled more debate, as critics dissected her words for inconsistencies. The media storm was a fire that could not be extinguished. Every attempt to douse it only seemed to make it burn hotter. Harry, meanwhile, found himself overwhelmed. The same press that he had long despised was now tearing apart his family in ways he could not control. He lashed out at reporters, threatened legal action, and retreated further into isolation. But none of it mattered. The storm was bigger than him, bigger than Meghan, bigger even than the monarchy. It had become a global obsession, a narrative that fed on conflict and thrived on uncertainty. Within the palace, the media storm forced difficult decisions. Advisors urged Charles to make a statement, to seize control of the narrative before it spiraled further out of hand. Some argued that silence would be interpreted as guilt, that the longer the crown waited, the more damaging the speculation would become. Others cautioned against rushing, warning that any misstep could make matters worse. Charles listened to them all, but he knew the truth. The storm was no longer something to be managed. It was something to be endured until the moment came when he himself could present the proof. The end of this chapter lingers on the chaos of the storm's peak. News channels aired live debates into the night, newspapers sold out within hours, and online platforms crashed under the weight of traffic. It felt as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the king to speak. Every day of silence only added to the tension, building anticipation for what Charles would reveal. The monarchy had faced scandals before, but none had unfolded with this kind of ferocity, this level of scrutiny, this global reach. The storm had swallowed them whole, and now, only the king could cut through the noise. Meghan's counterattack was as calculated as it was inevitable. She had built her reputation on controlling narratives, on reshaping the story to place herself at the center as the misunderstood heroine. The media storm that erupted over Archie and Lilibet threatened everything she had constructed. Silence would mean surrender, and surrender was never in her vocabulary. So she chose to fight back, unleashing a counteroffensive designed to reframe the controversy not as a matter of legitimacy, but as proof of the cruelty and prejudice she had long accused the monarchy of harboring. The first step in her counterattack was public sympathy. Meghan understood better than anyone that in the modern media landscape, emotion often mattered more than fact. She began appearing in carefully staged photographs, walking with Archie hand in hand, cradling Lilibet in tender, almost cinematic moments. These images were not candid. They were curated to project the image of a devoted mother under siege. Each photograph was released at key moments, coinciding with particularly damaging headlines, creating a visual counter-narrative. While the monarchy obsessed over documents and protocols, Meghan was simply being a mother. Then came the interviews. Meghan had always excelled in front of a camera, her background as an actress giving her an ability to deliver sincerity with precision. She agreed to sit down with sympathetic journalists, framing her story around themes of resilience and victimhood. The questions were soft, the answers emotional. She spoke of the pain of seeing her children questioned, the cruelty of having their legitimacy debated in public. She cast herself as a mother fighting to protect her family from an institution unwilling to accept them. Every tear shed, every pause for effect, was part of the performance, but it was powerful. Viewers across America and beyond wept with her, seeing not a duchess embroiled in scandal, but a woman wronged by forces larger than herself. Her allies amplified the narrative. Celebrity friends posted supportive messages, using words like strength, courage, and resilience. Activists tied her struggle to broader issues of racism and sexism, framing the controversy not as a question of lineage, but as yet another example of a powerful woman of color being unfairly targeted. The counterattack was effective because it shifted the battlefield. Instead of debating documents, Meghan was pulling the world into a conversation about prejudice, suffering, and identity. It was a battlefield she knew well, one where she had always been strongest. Harry played his part too, though with less polish. His anger was raw, his statements often clumsy, but they carried emotional weight. He lashed out at the media, accusing them of exploiting his family. He condemned the palace, suggesting that his father and brother were complicit in the attacks. His words were less measured than Meghan's, but that, too, served the strategy. It painted the picture of a husband consumed by love and outrage, willing to burn bridges to defend his wife and children. For Meghan, this was useful. It reinforced the story of unity between them, the image of a couple standing together against an unforgiving world. But Meghan's counterattack was not limited to public appearances and sympathetic interviews. Behind the scenes, she moved strategically to shore up her power. Legal threats were issued to media outlets that published particularly damaging claims. Lawyers drafted letters demanding retractions, not necessarily to win cases, but to create the appearance of strength. At the same time, Meghan's team worked tirelessly to discredit sources. Whistleblowers were painted as liars, journalists accused of bias, commentators dismissed as conspiracy theorists. The goal was simple: muddy the waters enough that the public would doubt everything. If no one could be sure what was true, Meghan's version of events could remain plausible. Yet the counterattack was not without cracks. For every glowing interview, there were critics who pointed out inconsistencies in her story. For every staged photograph, there were skeptics who noted the timing and accused her of manipulation. The more Meghan pushed her narrative, the more she invited scrutiny, and in that scrutiny, small contradictions began to emerge. She had always been skilled at bending truth into story, but the files Charles possessed were not stories. They were documents, hard evidence that could not be countered by emotion alone. Deep down, Meghan must have known this, and it was this awareness that added a note of desperation to her counterattack. The middle of this chapter reveals the strain this strategy placed on the family. William and Kate, watching from the sidelines, were frustrated by how effective Meghan's tactics remained. They knew the truth was on their side, but they also knew that truth often lost to emotion in the modern world. Harry grew more entrenched, his loyalty to Meghan hardening into defiance against his family. Charles, though resolute, found himself increasingly isolated. The counterattack was not just aimed at the press, it was aimed at him. Meghan's narrative painted him as the cold monarch, the unfeeling father, the man too consumed by tradition to love his grandchildren. It was a devastating portrait, one that hurt Charles deeply even as he prepared to expose the truth. The end of this chapter builds toward confrontation. Meghan's counterattack had succeeded in keeping her story alive, in rallying supporters, in muddying the waters. But Charles knew that no amount of interviews, photographs, or legal threats could erase the reality of what he held in his possession. The files were more powerful than any narrative, and once revealed, they would cut through every performance. Meghan's counterattack had bought her time, but time was running out. The king had chosen his path, and when he spoke, the world would no longer be debating narratives. It would be staring at proof. Harry's breaking point did not arrive in a single explosive moment. It came slowly, in fragments, each one chipping away at the fragile balance he had tried to maintain between his wife and the family he had left behind. For years, he had defined himself as Meghan's defender, the man willing to walk away from everything he knew to build a new life by her side. That role gave him purpose, even pride, but it also isolated him. Now, as the files in his father's possession became the subject of a global storm, Harry found himself cornered, unable to protect Meghan, unable to silence the doubts, and unable to reconcile the truth that weighed heavier with each passing day. The first signs of strain showed in his demeanor. Those who had once described Harry as affable, even playful, now saw only tension. His laughter was gone, replaced by short, sharp bursts of anger. He snapped at journalists, bristled during interviews, and seemed perpetually exhausted. The media storm surrounding Archie and Lilibet was unlike anything he had faced before, because it was not about his own actions, but about his children. As a father, he felt enraged. As a son, he felt betrayed. And as a man, he felt powerless. What drove Harry toward his breaking point was not only the press, but the silence of the palace. For him, Silence had always been a form of complicity. He remembered the way his mother, Diana, had been left unprotected, consumed by the media while the crown refused to speak. Now, he saw the same silence being deployed against Meghan and their children. He convinced himself that his father's refusal to publicly defend them was proof that the monarchy had turned its back on him entirely. Yet what he did not know was that Charles's silence was not born of indifference, but of preparation. The king was not ignoring the storm. He was waiting for the moment when the truth could be revealed. The middle of this chapter explores the personal toll of this tension. At home in Montecito, the cracks in Harry's world widened. He and Meghan argued, not always about the files themselves, but about how to respond. Meghan wanted to fight harder, to push more interviews, to escalate the counterattack. Harry, already weary of the spotlight, longed for retreat, for a quiet life away from constant scrutiny. Their disagreements grew sharper, and though they presented a united front in public, behind closed doors the strain was palpable. Harry loved his wife deeply, but he could not shake the gnawing fear that he was losing himself in the fight. Memories of his brother haunted him too. The sight of William on television, calm and composed, representing the monarchy with dignity, was like a knife to Harry's heart. He envied the steadiness William projected, even as he resented him for it. Their relationship, once the backbone of Harry's life, was now fractured beyond recognition. William's support for Charles's decision to act felt like betrayal piled upon betrayal. In Harry's mind, his brother had chosen the crown over family, tradition over love. Yet a small voice inside him whispered doubts. What if William was right? What if the truth, however painful, could not be denied? The breaking point came closer as the files themselves loomed larger in the public imagination. Though Harry had not seen them, he knew they existed. His father's refusal to dismiss the speculation outright confirmed it, and that knowledge gnawed at him day and night. What if there was something in those documents that even Meghan had not told him? What if the foundation of his entire life, his marriage, his children, his choices, was shakier than he dared admit? These thoughts tormented him, but he pushed them down, burying them beneath loyalty to Meghan. To admit doubt, even for a moment, felt like betrayal. Friends close to Harry noticed the change. He became more withdrawn, less willing to engage. His temper flared easily, but more often he seemed lost, staring into the distance as if trapped in a maze he could not escape. His breaking point was not just about the files or the media storm. It was about identity. Who was he now? The spare who had rejected the crown? The husband who had pledged himself to Meghan? The father whose children were at the center of a global scandal? Or was he simply a man caught between worlds, belonging to neither? The end of this chapter captures Harry on the edge of collapse. The strain of defending Meghan against the world, the isolation from his family, and the looming threat of his father's revelation combined into a weight he could no longer carry. He felt trapped in a role he had chosen but no longer controlled, a narrative that had once empowered him but now consumed him. His breaking point was inevitable. Whether it came in the form of an outburst, a confession, or a collapse, one truth was clear. Harry could not continue as he was. The files had forced him into a reckoning he could not escape, and the storm around him had left him with no safe harbor. Charles's dramatic reveal was the moment when whispers became declarations, when the shadows gave way to light, and when the crown itself entered the battle it had so carefully avoided for years. For weeks, the monarchy had been buffeted by leaks, speculation, and Meghan's counterattacks. Yet Charles had remained silent, holding back the files that could change everything. But silence has limits. A king cannot govern in rumor, nor can a monarchy survive under the weight of unanswered doubts. And so Charles, weary from the endless storm, made the decision that would define his reign. He would reveal the proof. The preparation for this moment was meticulous. This was not a man speaking off the cuff, nor was it a reactionary press release buried in the back pages of a newspaper. Charles understood the gravity of what he was about to do. He was not just addressing scandal. He was addressing succession, the very foundation of monarchy. Advisors debated endlessly about format and timing. Should it be a written statement, detached and clinical, or should the king himself stand before the cameras? Some argued for restraint, warning that his involvement would entangle him too deeply in personal family matters. Others insisted that only his voice, solemn and steady, could cut through the chaos and restore authority. In the end, Charles chose the latter. He would not delegate this. The world needed to hear from its king. When the announcement was made, anticipation spread like wildfire. Networks cleared their schedules, anchors spoke in hushed tones, and millions tuned in around the globe. The image of Charles walking into the room was stark. No pomp, no ceremony, just a man in a simple suit, carrying centuries of history on his shoulders. The silence was heavy as he began to speak, his voice calm, but edged with the weight of inevitability. He did not attack Meghan directly, nor did he indulge in melodrama. His words were precise, measured, the language of duty rather than emotion. He acknowledged the media storm, the doubts that had plagued the institution, and the pain it had caused his family. And then, slowly, he laid out the truth. He described the files, the discrepancies, the irregularities in records that could no longer be dismissed. He spoke of the importance of transparency, of the Crown's duty to uphold truth above all else. And then, with deliberate clarity, he revealed that the legitimacy of Archie and Lilibet's status as royal heirs was under formal question, supported by documented evidence. The effect was immediate and electrifying. The room seemed to freeze as his words echoed across screens. Journalists gasped, commentators struggled to respond, and audiences sat in stunned silence. For the first time, the monarchy had broken its silence not with denial or deflection, but with proof. The files Charles referenced were not rumors or leaks. They were official, verifiable documents. And in presenting them, he had not only challenged Meghan's narrative, but shattered it. The middle of this chapter captures the shockwaves that followed. In Britain, the reaction was seismic. Some praised Charles for his courage, for finally addressing the doubts that had corroded the monarchy's credibility. Others recoiled, horrified that a father would expose his own son's family in such a way. In America, where Meghan enjoyed greater support, the backlash was fierce. Commentators accused Charles of cruelty, of weaponizing his crown against his grandchildren. Social media exploded, with hashtags both defending and condemning the king. The world was split down the middle, each side convinced it had seen either the defense of tradition or the destruction of compassion. For Harry, the reveal was devastating. He had braced himself for confrontation, but nothing could prepare him for the sight of his father speaking so publicly, so definitively, about his children. The man he had once looked to for guidance was now the man dismantling his family's credibility before the world. Rage and grief consumed him in equal measure. Meghan, too, reacted with fury, condemning the statement as an orchestrated attack designed to humiliate her. Yet even as she lashed out, she could not erase the reality that the files existed. Emotion could stir hearts, but it could not erase documents. Within the palace, the mood was somber. William, though supportive of the decision, recognized the cost. He knew this was not just a political act, but a personal fracture that might never heal. Advisors felt both relief and dread. Relief that the truth was finally revealed, dread about the chaos it would unleash. For Charles, the reveal was not victory, but necessity. He had not spoken out of malice, but out of duty, and duty always came with sacrifice. The end of this chapter leaves the world in stunned silence. The proof had been revealed, the questions answered, but the fallout was only beginning. Charles had cut through the storm with the authority of a king, but in doing so, he had set in motion consequences that no one could fully predict. Would the monarchy emerge stronger for facing the truth, or weaker for exposing its divisions? Would the public side with the king's duty or Meghan's defiance? And most haunting of all, what would become of Harry, caught between a wife he vowed to protect and a father who had just exposed his family to the world? The global shockwaves began within minutes of King Charles's broadcast. In London, the announcement had aired in the evening, but by dawn in Sydney, the middle of the night in New York, and prime time in Delhi, the world was awake and reeling. Newsrooms scrambled, social media erupted, and households everywhere found themselves glued to their screens. This was not just a royal story. It was a global event, the kind that stopped conversations mid-sentence and forced even the most disinterested observers to pay attention. For centuries, the monarchy had represented continuity, tradition, and certainty. Now, with one statement, Charles had shaken those foundations, and the reverberations were felt across continents. In Britain, the initial reaction was one of disbelief. People poured into pubs, cafes, and online forums to debate what they had just heard. Some expressed admiration for the king's candor, believing that transparency was the only way to preserve the monarchy's integrity. Others were horrified, saying Charles had crossed a line by exposing his own grandchildren to such public scrutiny. Longtime supporters of the monarchy found themselves torn, struggling to reconcile their loyalty with the unsettling truth that had just been revealed. Even within Parliament, politicians issued statements that ranged from cautious support for the king's duty to stern warnings about destabilizing an already fragile institution. Across the Atlantic, the reaction was markedly different. In the United States, Meghan's allies and sympathizers dominated the airwaves. Talk show hosts denounced Charles as cold and vindictive, portraying Meghan once again as a woman unfairly targeted by a system too rigid to accept her. American networks framed the story not as one of lineage, but of persecution. To many Americans, Charles's reveal was not about duty but about cruelty, a desperate attempt by a monarchy clinging to power to discredit a woman who dared to challenge it. Within hours, prominent celebrities had posted messages of support for Meghan, amplifying her victim narrative and ensuring that the divide between Britain and America deepened further. The shockwaves extended well beyond the English-speaking world. In Europe, where monarchies still exist in countries like Spain, Sweden, and the Netherlands, commentators worried openly about the implications. If the British monarchy could be undermined by questions of legitimacy, what did that mean for the symbolic power of monarchy elsewhere? In republics, particularly in France and Germany, critics of the crown seized the moment to argue that the age of royalty was long past, that Charles's reveal proved the institution was outdated and fragile. In Commonwealth nations, the reactions were more complicated. Countries like Canada and Australia, where debates about severing ties to the crown were already simmering, found the controversy fueling Republican movements. Leaders were pressed to answer whether the monarchy, marred by scandal, still had a place as head of state. The middle of this chapter captures the intensity of the global media frenzy. Newspapers ran special editions, entire news cycles were dedicated to analyzing the files, and experts in law, history, and genealogy were called upon to weigh in. Some argued that Charles's decision was bold, even necessary, to protect the monarchy's credibility. Others insisted it was reckless, a move that would fracture the royal family beyond repair. Documentarians rushed to update scripts, publishers scrambled to capitalize on the controversy, and royal commentators who had spent decades covering the Windsors admitted they had never seen anything of this magnitude. The reaction on social media was even more volatile. Hashtags trended worldwide within minutes, some praising Charles for defending the truth, others declaring solidarity with Meghan. Memes, videos, and edited clips of Charles's broadcasts spread across platforms, often stripped of context and reshaped to fit partisan narratives. Online, the story became not just about the monarchy but about race, class, gender, and power, with users projecting their own struggles onto the saga. The result was a digital battlefield where facts and emotions collided, leaving no room for neutrality. The shockwaves also reached institutions outside politics and media. Religious leaders weighed in, some praising Charles for his commitment to truth, others condemning him for dragging children into a public controversy. Universities held debates about monarchy and modern identity. Even corporations, wary of aligning themselves too closely with either side, were forced to tread carefully in their associations with the Sussexes or the royal brand. The controversy seeped into advertising, entertainment, and even fashion, as designers distanced themselves from Meghan while others embraced her as a symbol of defiance. For Charles himself, the global reaction was both validation and burden. He had revealed the proof to protect the monarchy, but the intensity of the backlash showed him that truth alone would not bring peace. Instead, his decision had opened a fault line across the world, dividing nations, communities, and even families. Supporters praised him as a man of courage, a king who placed duty above sentiment. Critics painted him as ruthless, willing to sacrifice his own blood for the sake of tradition. He had expected controversy, but the scale of the shockwaves exceeded even his imagination. For Harry and Meghan, the global reaction was fuel. In America, the sympathy for Meghan gave her a platform stronger than ever before, allowing her to double down on her narrative of persecution. For Harry, however, the divide was painful. He saw how different the reactions were across the world. His father celebrated in Britain, his wife defended in America, and he realized that he was caught between those worlds, belonging fully to neither. The pressure pushed him further toward collapse, deepening his isolation and fueling his resentment. The end of this chapter captures the enormity of the shockwaves. Charles's reveal had not only answered the doubts, but unleashed a reckoning far larger than the family itself. It had become a global conversation about monarchy, legitimacy, and truth in an age of media saturation. The world was no longer watching passively. It was participating, arguing, and taking sides. The monarchy had survived wars and abdications, but never before had it faced a storm amplified by the full force of global connectivity. The shockwaves had reached every corner of the earth, and as the dust settled, one truth was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. Meghan's isolation did not come in a sudden collapse, but in gradual withdrawals, the steady peeling away of allies, opportunities, and influence. For years, she had thrived on networks of support, carefully curating a circle of friends, celebrities, and media outlets who amplified her voice and shielded her image. But in the wake of King Charles's reveal, that circle began to shrink. The proof he presented could not be dismissed as gossip or conspiracy. It carried the weight of authority, and authority has a way of reshaping allegiances. Those who once stood firmly in Meghan's corner began to quietly step back, fearful of being tied to someone whose credibility had been so publicly dismantled. The first to waver were the institutions that valued stability above loyalty. Corporate partners who had courted Meghan for her influence grew uneasy. In boardrooms, executives asked pointed questions. Would aligning with her damage their brands now that she was at war not only with the monarchy, but with documented proof? Endorsements slowed, projects were delayed, and meetings that once felt eager became hesitant. The streaming platforms that had invested heavily in her and Harry began to distance themselves, quietly cutting back on promotion of their work. For Meghan, who had built her post-royal life on the promise of marketability, these shifts were devastating. Without the shield of perception, her carefully constructed image began to crack. Celebrities, too, recalculated. In Hollywood, image is currency, and attaching oneself to controversy can be costly. While some continued to offer public support, many retreated into silence. Invitations dwindled, collaborations dissolved, and the red carpet appearances that once celebrated her presence became fewer and more strained. Meghan had always relied on the warmth of celebrity culture to validate her narrative. Now, that warmth cooled, replaced by polite distance. The whispered conversations that once praised her courage now questioned her motives. Even those who sympathized hesitated to be seen too closely aligned with someone the King of England himself had exposed. The middle of this chapter reveals the emotional toll isolation took on Meghan. In Montecito, her world grew smaller. Where once she had thrived on a constant flow of calls, meetings, and appearances, now the silence was suffocating. She leaned more heavily on Harry, but even he seemed frayed, unable to carry the weight of her anger and his own despair. The fortress of their home, once a symbol of independence and success, now felt like a gilded cage. She had fought to escape the rigid traditions of the monarchy, only to find herself trapped in isolation of a different kind, surrounded by walls of suspicion and doubt. Public opinion deepened her loneliness. The media storm had split audiences, but Charles's reveal tipped the balance. Where once she could rely on waves of sympathy, she now faced skepticism. Articles questioned her version of events, dissecting past interviews for inconsistencies. Online, even some of her defenders hesitated, unsure how to reconcile their support with the evidence presented. Meghan, who had always excelled at controlling the story, found herself losing grip on the narrative. Each attempt to reclaim it, through statements, photographs, or appearances, was met with harsher scrutiny. For Meghan, isolation was not only social but psychological. She had built her identity around strength, resilience, and control, but now cracks showed in her composure. Friends who remained close spoke of her sleepless nights, her obsession with monitoring headlines, her inability to let go of the storm around her. She replayed interviews, dissected every word, searched for ways to reframe herself. Yet the harder she tried, the more she exposed her vulnerability. The isolation stripped away the layers of performance, leaving her raw and unguarded in ways she had never intended the world to see. Inside the royal family, Meghan's isolation was also strategic. Charles and William, though aware of the cruelty of public opinion, did not intervene to soften her fall. They understood that any gesture of sympathy could be interpreted as weakness or as contradiction to the king's reveal. Their silence was deliberate, leaving Meghan to face the storm alone. To her, this silence felt like betrayal upon betrayal. To them, it was necessity. The monarchy could not afford to be seen wavering. The end of this chapter paints the image of a woman cut off from the very networks that had once sustained her. Hollywood kept its distance. Corporate allies hesitated. The monarchy turned its back. The public grew skeptical. Even her marriage strained under the weight of unrelenting scrutiny. Meghan, who had once commanded global stages and captivated millions, now found herself isolated in ways she had never anticipated. She had believed that her charisma, her story, and her will could carry her through anything. But isolation proved to be the one battle she could not fight with charm or defiance. It was quiet, suffocating, and relentless, leaving her with fewer allies, fewer options, and fewer places to turn. The royal reckoning was not confined to one dramatic event, but unfolded as a series of consequences, each more sobering than the last. When Charles revealed the files and the truth about Archie and Lilibet, he had not only pierced Meghan's narrative, but also forced the monarchy itself into a period of self-examination. For centuries, the institution had endured scandals and storms by retreating into silence, by allowing time and tradition to wash away public anger. But this time, silence was no longer an option. The king's decision to speak had broken with precedent, and now the monarchy had to confront the fallout head-on. Inside the palace, the reckoning began with a simple yet profound question: what now? Charles had upheld his duty by revealing the truth, but the act of revelation did not end the crisis. It merely shifted it. The monarchy was forced to decide how to position itself moving forward. Would Archie and Lilibet retain their titles, or would they be quietly removed from the line of succession? Would Harry be allowed to maintain any role within the family, or would his continued defense of Meghan make reconciliation impossible? These were not abstract questions. They cut directly into the future of the crown, into the narrative that would be handed down to the next generation. William stepped forward during this period with a firmness that surprised even those who knew him best. He had long been cautious, careful not to appear rash or emotional. But in the wake of his father's reveal, he saw clearly what needed to be done. To him, the monarchy could only survive if it projected stability, certainty, and strength. That meant closing ranks, tightening the circle, and ensuring that no ambiguity remained about the line of succession. He began to speak more publicly, projecting calm authority, emphasizing duty, and subtly positioning himself as the heir ready to guide the monarchy into a new era. Kate supported him with quiet strength. She understood that this reckoning was not only about their generation, but about their children. George, Charlotte, and Louis would one day inherit the monarchy, and they could not be burdened with the lingering doubts surrounding their cousins. Kate's presence in public became even more significant. Every appearance was carefully crafted to show continuity, warmth, and stability. Where Meghan's image fractured under scrutiny, Kate's only seemed to grow stronger, and the contrast between them became a narrative of its own. For Charles, the reckoning was more complex. He had acted out of duty, but as a father, the cost weighed heavily on him. He missed the days when his sons could stand together, when his family had not been consumed by division. Yet he knew that as king, his role was not to heal every wound, but to protect the monarchy's survival. That clarity gave him strength, but it also left him isolated. He had chosen crown over blood, and while history might judge him favorably for it, his heart carried the weight of a father who had lost one son to loyalty and another to defiance. Beyond the family, the reckoning extended to the institution itself. Advisors, Courtiers and officials all recognized that the monarchy could not continue as if nothing had happened. Public trust had been shaken, and trust once lost is hard to regain. Strategies were devised to rebuild confidence: increased transparency in royal records, more frequent communication with the press, and a renewed focus on service rather than ceremony. The monarchy began presenting itself less as an untouchable relic and more as a modern institution willing to face scrutiny. It was a risky shift, but one necessary to survive in an age where secrecy breeds suspicion. The reckoning also played out across the Commonwealth. Leaders in Canada, Australia, and the Caribbean nations seized on the controversy to renew debates about independence from the crown. Some argued that the scandal proved the monarchy was an outdated institution, too consumed by its own survival to serve as a unifying symbol. Others insisted that Charles's transparency had shown strength, that by confronting deception rather than concealing it, he had demonstrated why the monarchy still mattered. The conversations were heated, and while no immediate break occurred, the long-term stability of the crown across the Commonwealth remained uncertain. The middle of this chapter focuses on Harry, because no reckoning could be complete without him. For Harry, the king's reveal was not just a political act, but a personal betrayal. He felt exposed, humiliated, and cornered. The reckoning forced him into a painful awareness. He could no longer live in two worlds. He could not be both the loyal son and Meghan's defender. The monarchy had made its position clear, and if he continued to oppose it, he would be outside it forever. Friends described him as withdrawn, torn between rage and grief, desperate to find a path forward but unable to see one. His breaking point had passed, and now he faced the stark reality of his choices. Meghan's isolation only deepened during this period, and the reckoning left her with even fewer allies. She continued to fight, issuing statements and pursuing legal avenues, but the weight of the monarchy's reveal hung over her like a shadow she could not escape. Where once she had been a symbol of defiance, she now looked increasingly embattled, a figure fighting battles she could not win. For her, the reckoning meant exposure, and exposure meant vulnerability. The end of this chapter returns to Charles, standing alone in his study late at night. The files had been revealed, the truth spoken, the reckoning underway. Yet as he stared out at the London skyline, he understood that this was not the end of the storm but the beginning of a new era. The monarchy had survived, yes, but at a cost. A family divided, a son estranged, grandchildren caught in controversy, and a world left questioning what the crown truly meant in the 21st century. The reckoning was necessary, but it left scars that would never fully heal. Harry's silent tears became the truest symbol of how deeply the saga had cut into the heart of the royal family. To the world, he had always been the more open Windsor, the one unafraid to show emotion, to wear his heart on his sleeve. He had cried at his mother's funeral, spoken candidly about mental health, and allowed the public to see vulnerability where others in his family chose restraint. But now, in the aftermath of his father's reveal, his grief was not expressed in interviews or television specials. It was private, hidden away from cameras, a grief that came not with the noise of confrontation, but with the quiet weight of devastation. The beginning of this chapter takes us into those moments of solitude, when Harry sat alone in Montecito, staring out over manicured lawns that suddenly felt suffocating. For years, he had convinced himself that his life away from Britain was freedom. That by leaving behind the rigidity of royal life, he had chosen love over duty, authenticity over tradition. Yet as his father's words echoed around the world, he was forced to confront a brutal truth. The life he had built was unraveling under scrutiny he could no longer control. He had thought of himself as protector of his family, the one shielding Meghan and their children from harm. Now he could not even shield them from the documents held in his father's hands. The strain overwhelmed him in waves. He wept quietly at night, not always in front of Meghan, sometimes burying his face in his hands after she had gone to bed. He wept for the mother who had taught him compassion, for the brother who now seemed more enemy than friend, for the father who had chosen crown over blood, and most of all, for the children whose names were now debated on television screens around the world. To Harry, it felt like history repeating itself. Children caught in a storm they did not choose, innocence consumed by the cruelty of duty and media obsession. The difference was that this time, he was not the child being protected but the father unable to protect. The middle of this chapter explores how those silent tears reflected his deeper inner conflict. Harry had long defined himself by loyalty, to his regiment, to his wife, to his mother's memory. That loyalty had given him strength, but it had also blinded him. He had thrown himself into Meghan's narrative with unflinching devotion, convinced that the world was against them, convinced that only he could stand between her and destruction. But Charles's reveal shattered that certainty. The existence of the files, the irrefutable nature of the evidence, gnawed at him in ways he could not admit aloud. He wanted desperately to believe Meghan completely, to shut out all doubt, but the king's words lingered in his mind. What if there was more to the story than Meghan had told him? What if his father, for all his flaws, had not acted out of malice but out of truth? These questions tormented him, and the torment spilled into his marriage. He and Meghan argued late into the night, their voices carrying through the quiet of their California estate. Meghan insisted that they must fight harder, that the monarchy was targeting her out of fear and prejudice. Harry, worn thin, wondered if retreat was wiser, if silence might finally bring them peace. The arguments ended not with resolution but with exhaustion, both of them turning away from each other in bed, both crying silently for different reasons. For Meghan, it was anger. For Harry, it was despair. The image of Harry's silent tears also reached beyond the walls of his home. Friends who managed to speak with him during this time described a man consumed by sorrow. He avoided public events, canceling appearances and retreating from the spotlight. When he did appear, his eyes looked tired, his shoulders heavy, his once easy smile gone. Those who knew him best said they had never seen him so broken, not even after Diana's death. Then, he had been a boy robbed of a mother. Now, he was a man realizing he had lost his family, his country, and perhaps even his place in history. Within the palace, news of Harry's emotional collapse filtered back. Charles heard reports of his son's grief and felt a pang of guilt sharper than he had expected. William, though resolute in his support of their father's decision, admitted privately that the sight of Harry in such despair haunted him. But neither man could reach out. The divide was too deep, the wounds too raw. Harry's silent tears were his alone to carry, and the isolation of that grief only made them heavier. The end of this chapter leaves us with a portrait of a man caught between worlds, no longer able to return to the family he left behind, yet unable to fully escape the shadow of the monarchy. Harry wept not only for what had been lost, but for what could never be regained. His silent tears spoke of a truth he could not voice, that in his attempt to protect those he loved, he had helped ignite the very storm that destroyed them. And in that silence, the tragedy of his life became clear. A prince who gave up everything for love, only to find himself with nothing but grief. What comes next is the question that loomed over Britain, the Commonwealth, and the world once King Charles had revealed the truth. The files had been spoken aloud, the secrecy broken, the monarchy reshaped before the eyes of millions. But history does not pause after revelations. It presses forward, demanding answers. The monarchy, fractured by scandal and fortified by truth, now stood at a crossroads. Would it emerge stronger, purified by transparency, or weaker, permanently scarred by division? And what of Harry, Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet? Where would their futures lead after the storm had consumed them? The beginning of this chapter captures the immediate aftermath of the reveal. The palace, long accustomed to controlled rhythms and carefully timed ceremonies, found itself in uncharted waters. Meetings stretched late into the night, aides drafting documents, lawyers parsing every implication, advisors debating strategy. The monarchy could not allow ambiguity to linger. The world had heard the truth, and now it wanted clarity. What did this mean for succession? Would Archie and Lilibet retain their titles, or would they be stripped away in a formal declaration? Would Harry and Meghan be recognized as members of the royal family in any capacity, or would they be cast adrift entirely? The urgency of these questions gave the days after Charles's reveal a sense of breathless anticipation. In Britain, parliamentarians added their voices, pressing for statements about the legal standing of the monarchy. While technically constitutional matters remained unchanged, the perception of doubt forced a conversation about codifying rules that had long been treated as custom. Some MPs demanded legislation to clearly define succession requirements in the modern era. Others insisted the crown should be left to govern itself. But the debate underscored a deeper truth. Charles's decision had not only shaken the monarchy internally, it had sparked questions about its place in a modern democracy. The middle of this chapter turns to the royal family itself, because the question of what comes next was most acute within their private lives. William and Kate doubled down on public appearances, their presence designed to project continuity. For them, the path forward was clear. Show the world a monarchy that was stable, united, and focused on service. Their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, became even more visible symbols of the crown's future, carefully photographed at events that emphasized tradition and innocence. For William, the reckoning had clarified his mission. He would be the bridge between his father's reign and the future, ensuring that doubt never again undermined the legitimacy of the monarchy. For Charles, what came next was both relief and burden. He had spoken the truth, but speaking it did not resolve the pain. His relationship with Harry seemed irreparably broken, and as a father, that reality haunted him. Yet as a king, he understood that this was the sacrifice he had chosen. What came next for him was a reign defined by vigilance, by the constant reminder that secrecy had nearly undone the crown. He committed himself to transparency where possible, to ensuring that records, ceremonies, and traditions would be beyond reproach. The monarchy, he resolved, would not again be consumed by whispers. For Meghan, the path forward was far less clear. Her counterattacks had bought her time, but the weight of Charles's reveal left her isolated. What came next for her was survival. She leaned into the support she still had in America, continuing to frame herself as a victim of cruelty and prejudice. She explored new projects, new platforms, and new audiences, but each effort was shadowed by the doubts Charles had unleashed. Meghan's future would not be the glittering ascent she had once imagined. Instead, it would be a fight to remain relevant, to keep her voice alive in a world that had begun to turn skeptical. For Harry, the future was even more uncertain. His silent tears had marked the breaking of his spirit, and now he faced choices he could not delay. Would he cling to Meghan's narrative and remain estranged from his family forever? Or would he, at some point, attempt reconciliation, even if it meant confronting painful truths about his marriage and his children? Friends close to him whispered that Harry was lost, caught between loyalty and longing, unable to choose, yet unable to remain in limbo forever. What came next for him was perhaps the most tragic uncertainty of all, because unlike his father or his brother, his future no longer felt tied to a clear path. The end of this chapter expands outward, asking what comes next not only for the family but for the world. In the Commonwealth, debates about monarchy intensified. In some nations, Republican movements gained strength, fueled by the scandal. In others, the monarchy's transparency was seen as proof of its adaptability. Globally, the story continued to spark discussions about tradition, legitimacy, and the role of royalty in an age where truth is dissected in real time. The monarchy had survived the storm, but the storm had changed it forever. What comes next is not an ending but a continuation, a reminder that truth carries consequences that ripple far beyond the moment they are spoken. For Charles, it was the burden of a reign defined by duty. For William, it was the clarity of his mission as heir. For Meghan, it was isolation and reinvention. For Harry, it was grief and uncertainty. For the monarchy, it was survival at a cost. The files had been revealed, the truth spoken, but the reckoning had only begun. The future lay ahead, uncertain and heavy, waiting for the choices yet to come. The conclusion of this saga carries the weight of centuries of history, the ache of family wounds, and the unavoidable truth that even monarchs are not immune to the consequences of choices. When King Charles revealed the files on Archie and Lilibet, he did more than present documents. He drew a line between past and future, between silence and truth, between loyalty to blood and loyalty to the crown. That choice, once made, could never be undone, and its ripples stretched far beyond Buckingham Palace, touching every member of his family and echoing through the wider world. The beginning of this conclusion rests on the human cost. Harry, broken by grief, had become the symbol of the storm's cruelty. His loyalty to Meghan had led him down a path from which there was no easy return, and now he was left to navigate the fallout with only fragments of family left to him. Meghan, once celebrated as a force of charisma and strength, found herself standing alone, her allies thinned, her credibility fractured. The children, Archie and Lilibet, too young to understand the world that debated their existence, would one day inherit the scars of this conflict whether they wanted them or not. For Charles, the cost was clear. He had secured the survival of the monarchy, but he had lost the peace of his family. For William, the cost was less visible, but no less real. He had been thrust firmly into the role of heir not just in title, but in responsibility, carrying the duty of ensuring the monarchy never faltered again. The middle of this conclusion looks outward, beyond the family, to what the world saw in this moment. For some, Charles's reveal was a triumph of duty, a reminder that truth cannot be hidden even when it is painful. For others, it was an act of cruelty, proof that the monarchy will sacrifice even its own for survival. Debates over monarchy's relevance flared across continents, but one truth emerged clearly. The crown remained central to global conversations, not because of its pageantry, but because of its humanity. This was not the story of distant figures in castles, but of a father, sons, and grandchildren torn apart by loyalty, ambition, and truth. It was this humanity, messy, tragic, and raw, that made the world unable to look away. The end of this conclusion circles back to the heart of the story, the question of legacy. Charles had acted not for himself, but for the crown, and in doing so, he ensured that William and George would inherit a monarchy cleared of whispers, hardened by fire. Yet his choice will always be remembered as both victory and sacrifice. History will ask whether he was right to reveal the files, whether truth justified the destruction of family bonds, and whether monarchy can ever survive when it demands such a price. For Meghan and Harry, legacy will be more complicated. They will be remembered as the couple who defied the monarchy, who tried to reshape their roles, and who ended up caught in a storm bigger than themselves. Their story will forever be entwined with Charles's decision, and no reinvention can fully erase that. The conclusion rests on reflection, for the audience as much as for the family. What is the value of truth when it divides rather than unites? What does it mean to be loyal to a spouse, to a parent, to a nation? And how much should one sacrifice for duty? These questions linger, unresolved, because the truth of this saga is not clean or easy. It is painful, complex, and human. That is why it grips us, because in the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace we see not perfection, but the same struggles of love, loyalty, and betrayal that echo in every family, magnified by crowns and cameras. The final image is one of silence, not the silence of avoidance, but the silence after a storm has passed. The monarchy remains, scarred but standing. The family remains, divided but bound by blood. And the world, having witnessed the reveal, carries away its own interpretations, some seeing duty, some seeing cruelty, all seeing humanity laid bare. The truth has been spoken, but the wounds will take generations to heal. And so, the story ends not with resolution, but with reflection. The crown endures, but at what cost? The family breathes, but under what weight? The world watches, but with what lessons? The epilogue begins not with the clamor of media headlines or the heated debates of Parliament, but with the slow passage of time. Weeks turned into months, and the initial shock of Charles's reveal gave way to reflection. The world moved on to other crises, other stories, yet the impact of the king's decision lingered, shaping perceptions of monarchy in ways that would endure for decades. For Charles himself, the reveal became the defining act of his reign, a moment historians would debate endlessly. Was it courage, cruelty, or inevitability? For the royal family, it became the scar that reminded them of what had been lost in the pursuit of truth. The long-term consequences unfolded on multiple fronts. In Britain, the monarchy's reputation, though bruised, stabilized. By confronting the doubts directly, Charles had ensured that whispers no longer held power. For many, his act was seen as one of integrity, a refusal to allow deception to corrode the crown. Yet the price was steep. A son estranged, grandchildren caught in controversy, and a monarchy perceived as ruthless even when honest. The duality of Charles's reign was now set. He was the king who saved the monarchy, but also the father who sacrificed family in the process. William's role grew steadily in the aftermath. Public opinion began to shift toward him as the face of the monarchy's future, a younger leader untainted by the storms of the past. He and Kate projected stability, continuity, and the quiet promise of renewal. Their children, seen laughing at events or bowing politely at ceremonies, became the symbols of a monarchy still rooted in innocence. In contrast to the turbulence surrounding Harry and Meghan, William's family appeared almost idyllic, and that contrast cemented their role in the public imagination as the true heirs of the crown's legacy. For Harry and Meghan, the years ahead proved more complicated. Meghan's isolation deepened, but she continued to reinvent herself, exploring new projects and causes in America. She maintained a loyal following, particularly among those who saw her as a symbol of resistance to old institutions. Yet the shadow of Charles's files never fully faded. Every interview, every appearance, every new venture was weighed against the credibility she had lost. For Harry, the struggle was more personal. He remained torn between love and loyalty, unable to reconcile his devotion to Meghan with his longing for the family he had left behind. His tears may have dried, but the grief never fully healed, leaving him a man perpetually caught between two worlds. The epilogue's middle section widens its gaze to the global stage. In Commonwealth nations, the scandal accelerated debates about independence. Some countries used it as fuel to argue that the monarchy was an outdated institution, clinging to survival through painful revelations. Others saw in Charles's act a rare example of honesty from an ancient system, proof that monarchy could adapt to modern scrutiny. The divide was stark, and in some places, referendums loomed closer. Whether the monarchy survived globally or retreated into a more British-centered role, the controversy had forced the conversation in a way no politician could have done alone. Culturally, the story of Charles, Harry, and Meghan became a touchstone. Films were written, books published, documentaries produced. The saga was dissected in classrooms, debated in universities, and dramatized in theaters. For some, it was the story of a king who chose duty over love. For others, it was the story of a woman silenced by power. For still others, it was the tragedy of a son caught in the crossfire. Each interpretation revealed more about the world viewing the story than about the story itself. That was the true legacy. The saga became a mirror in which societies saw their own struggles with truth, loyalty, and identity. The end of the epilogue returns to the personal. Imagine Charles in his later years, sitting quietly in a study. The noise of the storm long past, but the memories still vivid. He reflects on his choice, on the truth he revealed, and on the cost it demanded. He thinks of William, steady and ready. He thinks of Harry, distant but still his son. He thinks of Meghan, the outsider who changed everything. And he thinks of Archie and Lilibet, whose names became the center of a global storm they never asked for. The king knows history will judge him, but he also knows history will never fully understand the private ache that accompanied his public duty. And so, the story ends not with crowns or ceremonies, but with a quiet reflection on truth itself. Truth preserves, but truth wounds. It can save institutions, but destroy families. It can inspire trust, but breed resentment. What comes next for the monarchy remains uncertain, but one lesson is clear. In an age of global scrutiny, secrecy cannot survive, and truth, however painful, will always find its way to light. History has a way of softening or sharpening moments depending on how they fit into the larger arc of time. When future historians turn their gaze on Charles's reign, it will not be the ceremonial coronation that defines him, nor even his decades as heir apparent. It will be this, the night he spoke truth to the world about his own grandchildren, exposing secrets that shook his family to its core and reverberated around the globe. In that moment, he was both monarch and father, judge and witness, guardian of the crown and betrayer of blood. The paradox is what will ensure that the story is never forgotten. In the immediate years that followed, the monarchy adjusted. Transparency became the hallmark of Charles's reign. Every birth, every christening, every record that had once been quietly filed away was made public with unusual clarity. It was a direct response to the storm. Never again would whispers of deception be allowed to corrode the foundation of the crown. The public, at first wary, began to see this openness as strength. Slowly, trust returned. By the time William began to take on more responsibility as heir, the monarchy's legitimacy was no longer questioned. Charles had paid the price in family harmony, but in doing so, he secured the institution's survival. Harry and Meghan's story, however, drifted in the opposite direction. What had once been their platform of strength, control of narrative, became their greatest weakness. With every year that passed, Charles's reveal cast a longer shadow over their words. Projects still emerged, speeches were still given, but each was measured against the memory of that night when the king had spoken and the world had listened. Their legacy became inseparable from the controversy. To some, they remained symbols of resistance. To others, they were forever the couple who had tried to rewrite the crown's story and lost. Generationally, the saga imprinted itself on William's children. George grew up in a monarchy far more transparent than the one his father had known, where lineage was protected not by silence, but by proof. Charlotte and Louis, too, carried the awareness that their futures depended not only on tradition but on public trust. They would inherit a monarchy scarred by division but strengthened by honesty, and the lesson of Charles's reveal would be etched into their understanding of duty. To them, truth would not be a burden but a safeguard. The wider world treated the saga as both tragedy and spectacle. Universities taught it as a case study in modern monarchy, a collision between ancient institutions and global media. Writers and filmmakers returned to it repeatedly, each retelling emphasizing different aspects. Some painted Charles as the courageous king, others as the cold father. Some cast Meghan as the victim of cruelty, others as the architect of deception. Harry's role shifted depending on perspective, either the loyal husband undone by love or the lost prince consumed by choices beyond his control. The fact that no single narrative prevailed ensured that the story remained alive, debated, and reinterpreted by every generation. The extended epilogue closes with reflection. In the stillness of history's gaze, one truth emerges. Monarchy is not sustained by perfection, but by endurance. Charles's decision proved that truth, though painful, is the only soil in which endurance can grow. Meghan and Harry's fall from favor showed that narratives built on concealment cannot withstand scrutiny forever. And the family itself, fractured but surviving, demonstrated that even in its darkest hours, the crown endures because it adapts. So when future generations look back, they will see not just a scandal or a revelation, but a turning point. A king who chose duty over love, a son who wept in silence, a wife who fought against the storm, children who became symbols without ever asking to be, and a world that could not look away because, in the end, this was not just a royal story. It was a human one, written in the language of truth, loss, and survival. In the days that followed, the news cycle refused to let the story rest. Every channel, every outlet, every blog was carrying updates, speculations, and heated debates about what had truly unfolded on that stage and behind the curtains. Some outlets painted Denzel as a betrayed father whose private family matters had been ripped from his hands in the cruelest, most public way imaginable. Others spun the story as Joy Behar's bold act of journalistic truth-telling, framing it as exposing a legacy of secrets too heavy to ignore. Both narratives fed into each other, and as the fire grew, so did the stakes for everyone involved. For Denzel, the fallout was personal. He had always been one of those rare Hollywood figures who managed to straddle the line between superstardom and grounded humanity. He was admired for his acting, respected for his wisdom, and praised for his family values. To see him storming off a set, visibly shaken, cursing on live television, and then going silent afterward left fans unsettled. They weren't used to seeing him that way. He had built his career on composure, discipline, and integrity, and now the world was witnessing a fracture in that image. Joy Behar, on the other hand, was facing both applause and backlash in equal measure. Her loyal supporters defended her choice, calling it bravery, claiming she was simply holding a powerful man accountable to the truth. But the criticism was sharp and relentless. People called it cruel, exploitative, and deeply unethical to take a family letter, especially one allegedly from an estranged child, and broadcast it for entertainment value. The line between talk show banter and personal destruction had never been thinner, and many viewers felt Joy had crossed it without hesitation. Behind the scenes, producers of the show were scrambling. Ratings had skyrocketed, but the cost was steep. They were hit with legal threats, PR nightmares, and the very real possibility that one of their most respected guests would never return. Leaked reports suggested that Denzel's team had demanded an internal investigation into how the letter was obtained and who gave Joy the green light to air it. No one wanted to admit fault, but it was obvious someone had calculated the risk and pushed forward anyway. The Washington family remained largely quiet, which only fueled curiosity. Every silence was interpreted as confirmation of some hidden truth. Paparazzi camped outside his home. Old acquaintances and distant relatives suddenly emerged in tabloids, offering stories and opinions that no one could verify. Social media spun conspiracy theories, connecting dots that may not have even existed. The entire ordeal turned into not just a television moment, but a cultural event. One of those rare instances where a single outburst ripples into conversations about celebrity, privacy, family, and betrayal across the globe. And yet, in the middle of the chaos, one question remained unanswered. What exactly did that letter say, and why had it been written in the first place? Joy had read excerpts on air, but she hadn't revealed the entire thing. The fragments she shared hinted at estrangement, disappointment, and unhealed wounds. But fragments are dangerous. They leave room for interpretation, exaggeration, and sensationalism. Without context, without Denzel's side, the letter became a weapon wielded by public opinion. For the fans who admired him, it wasn't about whether the letter was real or not. It was about respect. They wanted to see him treated as the man they had watched for decades, the one who stood tall, delivered iconic roles, and inspired generations. To them, seeing his private life reduced to talk show fodder felt like a betrayal not only to him, but to everyone who valued dignity over spectacle. The next chapter in this saga wasn't going to be about what Joy did, or even what Denzel said in anger. It was about the larger battle, the fight between truth and spectacle, between privacy and exposure. Would Denzel take control of the narrative? Would Joy stand by her choice and double down, or would she crack under the weight of criticism? And more importantly, what role would the audience play in deciding whose story mattered more? The truth behind the letter or the dignity of the man who never wanted it read in the first place? The tension only grew heavier with every passing day, setting the stage for revelations that promised to either heal the wounds or make them even deeper. The world was watching, waiting, and whispering, because once the curtain had been pulled back, there was no going back to silence. The audience thought they had already seen the peak of the drama when Jesse Waters dropped the bombshell, but what followed pushed the entire narrative into darker and more disturbing territory. Harry, pale and visibly weakened, was moved from his private residence under the cover of night to a secured medical facility. Despite the palace's attempt to downplay the incident as a minor medical concern, leaks from within the hospital revealed that the doctors had confirmed toxicology tests showing a foreign substance in his bloodstream. The whispers surrounding the exact type of poison only added to the sense of dread, with one insider suggesting that it was not something that could have been acquired casually from a store or pharmacy. It was a rare compound, difficult to obtain, one that suggested careful planning and deliberate intent. The shock was not just that Harry had been poisoned, but that whoever had done it had access to something most people would never even know existed. This revelation made the entire affair feel less like a domestic dispute gone wrong and more like a meticulously orchestrated operation, leaving people wondering just how many layers of secrets were still hidden behind palace walls. The fallout from this discovery was immediate and ferocious. Commentators across television and social media tore apart every aspect of Harry and Meghan's relationship, with Meghan herself becoming the focal point of blame. Some voices were cautious, reminding the public that no direct evidence yet tied her to the poisoning, but the overwhelming tide of speculation painted her as the mastermind. Old interviews were dragged back into the spotlight, moments where she seemed distant, ambitious, or dismissive, now reframed as chilling foreshadowing. Even their Netflix appearances and glossy photographs were dissected frame by frame for clues of hidden resentment or power struggles. To many, the couple who once marketed themselves as symbols of modern love and freedom were now reduced to a cautionary tale about ambition, betrayal, and the high price of chasing fame. Every headline screamed a variation of the same unspoken question. If Meghan truly had a hand in this, what was her endgame? Was it financial gain, freedom from a marriage gone sour, or something far more sinister? As the story snowballed, something unexpected began happening. People who had previously defended Meghan started turning silent, while others who had once worked closely with her began to share unsettling anecdotes. A former aide hinted at a pattern of controlling behavior, saying Meghan often sought to isolate Harry from those who disagreed with her. Another acquaintance claimed she had once overheard Meghan speaking cryptically about getting rid of obstacles that stood in her path. Though these accounts were unverified, the timing of their emergence made them appear damning in the court of public opinion. For Harry, the betrayal was compounded by the fact that the people rallying around him now were the very ones he had distanced himself from when he chose to align his life with Meghan. Old friends, estranged family members, and even critics came forward to express sympathy, suggesting that whatever his past choices had been, no one deserved this. The sympathy for Harry only deepened the divide between how he and Meghan were being perceived. He, the tragic victim of manipulation and malice, and she, the cold and calculating figure at the center of an unraveling scandal. The institution of the monarchy could no longer ignore the storm brewing outside its gates. For King Charles, the situation presented not just a personal tragedy but a direct threat to the stability of the crown. Rumors swirled of secret meetings behind closed doors, where legal advisors, security chiefs, and senior royals debated the best course of action. Should they publicly condemn Meghan? Should they cut her off entirely, stripping her of every last shred of royal privilege? Or should they remain silent, hoping that the weight of public scrutiny would destroy her credibility without the monarchy appearing to interfere? None of the options were clean. Every move carried risk. Too aggressive a stance could make Harry feel abandoned in his darkest hour. Too passive a response could make the royals look complicit in covering up a crime. The tightrope they had to walk was made even thinner by the relentless coverage of the media, who were broadcasting every rumor, every leak, and every theory to a world that could not look away. Each development was being live-streamed, tweeted, and debated as though it were part of an unfolding Netflix series. And the royal family's every silence only fueled the sense that something catastrophic was still to come. The longer Meghan remained silent, the more her absence became its own kind of evidence in the minds of the public. Where was she? Why had she not appeared with a statement, a denial, or even a carefully staged photograph of concern for her husband? Every hour of silence was dissected as though it were a confession. By the time she did break her silence, the damage was already done. Her statement, delivered through a spokesperson, insisted on her innocence and accused the media of conducting a witch hunt. But the words fell flat. Rather than calm the storm, they only stoked it further, with critics mocking her as tone-deaf and self-absorbed, caring more about her image than her husband's life. For many, the carefully polished words were proof of her detachment, her inability to respond like a woman genuinely distraught over her husband's near-death experience. And so, rather than quelling the controversy, Meghan's response added another layer of fire to an already raging inferno, leaving the world more divided, more suspicious, and more hungry for answers than ever.